thank you. Well, thanks, Christian, for that introduction, and thanks everybody for attending for this afternoon's webinar. The way the system works, I have to ask Christian to move to the next slide. So you'll hear me saying next slide, which will be quite interesting. But anyway, yeah, welcome to today, and I hope to go on for about 45 minutes on some of the principles around monitoring and evaluation, particularly for advocacy. During this afternoon's webinar. And as Christian said, do feel free to type in questions, and if it's relevant to the slide I'm talking about, then of course I'll answer it then, but for more broad questions then we can talk more about them at the end. So Christian, the first slide please. So the purpose of this webinar today is really to provide some insights into M&E for advocacy, and that's the very specific focus I'm going to take today, because there are many approaches to evaluation and to monitoring, but in my experience, my experience has been mainly around advocacy-based projects. And the topics I'm going to talk about will provide a foundation for issues that are going to be discussed at the next TCWG meeting, but the principles I'll be talking about today will apply to any advocacy-based projects requiring M&E, which of course is all of them. And one of the main weaknesses of M&E in the NGO sector has always been, okay, we know really about the process and what we go through to achieve what we want to achieve, but we don't often look at the impact and what comes out right at the end, particularly around advocacy, which is quite difficult to evaluate. There are ways of doing it, which I'll share some approaches today, but it's often a bit missed out because it's a bit more challenging than just looking at process and just saying, yes, we did that, we did this, we did that, and that's fine. So that's the purpose of today. Next slide, please. My experience really has been most recently around evaluating two advocacy-based projects. One of them was something called Link Up, which was looking at strategies for integrating SRH, sexual reproductive health, and HIV services for young people in 5 African and Asian countries. And more recently, supporting the M&E around community advocacy for policy change around harm reduction. And this project in particular was very interesting to evaluate because it was purely based around advocacy. And we, at the end, wanted to see if the advocacy that the organisations had carried out had actually changed any policies. What impact had it actually had? They'd spoken to lots of people, so the ticks in the work plan were okay. But had it actually made any difference? And therefore, this project for me was very interesting from an advocacy perspective and an evaluation perspective. What did I learn from doing these two bits of evaluation? Well, firstly, advocacy is complex. It's multifaceted, which makes it hard to evaluate, but it can be done, but it is very complex. And secondly, because advocacy is such a long process, we often at the end of a project don't actually start seeing any impact from our advocacy, because that might spill over beyond the end of the project. And also sometimes progress does not mean success because it's very hard to attribute certain outcomes to advocacy activities. But secondly, also, if something seems to have stagnated, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because without any kinds of intervention, nothing may have happened anyway. So in a sense, this kind of discussion about what has been achieved, can we connect it to activities, because this hasn't worked, is it failure? All these discussions around evaluating advocacy are carried out right at the end. And often we find that progress has been made, even though it looks like there hasn't actually much been achieved, but other things have been actually gained from the project. So the next slide, please. So this session is going to be basically in 5 sections, definitions and background, and then a brief discussion about what is truth. This is a very, very short discussion really about what is truth, because when it comes to research, which is my previous field, and also M&E, trying to find out what is actually happening is sometimes quite difficult, and we need to select an approach that finds this out. But there are different views we can take, which we can use in the M&E. I want to talk very briefly about the steps for setting up an M&E program, and lastly, just a brief discussion about application, and then some time for Q&A. I'll try and finish this in around about 45 minutes, so we have enough time for discussion at the end. But if I don't get through everything, we will still finish on time, but the slides will be available and the recording will be available and of course I'll be available by email afterwards if you have any specific questions. Okay, next slide, please, Christian. So firstly, looking at definitions and background. Next slide. So two core terms, obviously, monitoring and evaluation. Monitoring is the routine tracking and reporting of priority information about a program or project. Its inputs, so what goes into it, its intended outputs, what actually you expect to get out of it, the actual outcomes, what does it actually achieve in reality, and then the impacts. And this is very important, and as I mentioned right at the top of this discussion, is the impact. It's the bit that's often missed out in M&E because the other things are easier to measure, but the impacts are less easy to measure. And then secondly, evaluation. This is the bit that comes right at the end, which is the rigorous collection of information about program activities, characteristics, outcomes that determine its merit or worth. Has it actually worked? Has it done what you thought it would achieve? If it hasn't, what has it achieved and what should be done now? And the last point is evaluation particularly provides information for improvements, lessons learned. So we've done this project, we've achieved this, we haven't achieved that, so what can we learn about this to use in the future? Okay, next slide, please. So why do we do it? Well, to reflect on process and performance, and adjust before it's too late, because good projects are flexible. If halfway through we're doing some monitoring and it seems to be going in a different direction or not achieving what it was supposed to, it can be tweaked, it can be changed, and therefore it allows flexibility. Second, learning lessons for future projects. Thirdly, it means collecting evidence-based information and for strategic decision making. So it means we're collecting information all the way through. And I should say at this point, good, effective projects should have a strong strategy for M&E right from the beginning. So when you're designing your work plan, what you aim to do in a year or 2 years or 3 years, at that point, an organisation should also be thinking, how will we monitor, how will we evaluate, what kind of evidence do we need? And therefore it should be built into the whole project writing process. Monitoring and evaluation provide stories, personal stories about impact, which are very useful, and it also provides hard evidence for future resource mobilisation. It provides transparency. Most, if not all, donors of projects always want to know how it's going, particularly long projects. The projects I mentioned I'd worked on at the beginning were both 3-year projects. So donors are very keen to know, well, how's it actually going? How are you spending this money we're giving to you? Is it having the impact you expected? What are you doing to make sure the long-term goals are achieved? And that links to the last point as well, accountability to network and donors. First to the donors, obviously, as I've just mentioned, but also to the network. When an NGO is running a project, often it's working with partners. So the partners want to know how it's going, and therefore everybody is aware of the progress, the process, and whether it's going to achieve what it wanted. Okay, the next slide, please. These are some key terms for M&E. I'm not going to read them all out because that's hugely bad teaching, and also it's copied largely from a UNAIDS document which I can share after this presentation. But it does provide useful definitions, and I will pick out just a couple. First of all, the outcomes halfway down. These are the short-term and medium-term effects of an intervention's outputs. So has there been a change in knowledge? Are attitudes any different? Is there a change in attitudes? Is there a change in behaviours? This is slightly different to objective, because objectives are things you aim for in a certain time, but often they'll be linked to outcomes. So you want to do this by this particular time to generate these things, these outcomes, and they're the things you measure in M&E. So what are the outcomes here? And then goal, just this last one I'll highlight on this slide. The goal is the very long-term thing you're aiming for right at the end, and these are very, very broad. And everything we put in place before we reach the goal will lead to the goal. So therefore the goal is the very last thing you hope to achieve, and it's often a long-term outcome of a program or intervention. So it'll be quite generic, it will be quite general, but everything that comes before that, the outcomes and objectives, will be more specific, more focused, and will give you a pathway to achieving the long-term goal of a program. Okay, next slide, please. So just the last slide of this introductory bit. So what are the steps in developing an M&E strategy? Well, these are the various steps, and bits of these we'll be talking about as we go through the rest of today's presentation, but it's deciding which programs to monitor and evaluate, deciding who to involve, because even though in many organizations there's an M&E officer who does the M&E, other people are involved as well, often other people collecting information that will be used for the monitoring and evaluation, deciding on key issues to address, identifying information that is actually required for M&E, because there are different types of information which you'll need for different bits of the strategy. The most obvious ones are the process type bits of evidence that you can say, yes, we did this training, we ran this project, we did this, we did that. But also there's other information that you need to collect, more about impact, more about the longer term implications of what's been done. Deciding how to collect the information, and I'll talk a bit about a couple of tools that we used for advocacy evaluation. Considering the ethics of data collection. Now, this is quite important because this is something which is very, very strong in pure research. Ethics is a huge component in pure research when it comes around protecting informants, protecting confidentiality, protecting people from harm, and it's also is important in M&E as well. Final reports, for example, at the end of a project are in danger sometimes of betraying information about particular individuals. So ethics should weave through all M&E just like it should in pure research. And then, of course, after that, collecting and analysing the information. I'll talk a bit about that as we go through. And then communicating the findings. So you've done a big M&E, and some of these things cost thousands of euros. What's going to be done with it? Where's it going to go? Obviously, it's going to go to the donors because they'll want to be accountable to the people who gave them money. But also, what are you going to do with the information? There will be useful stuff that's been gathered, and I would hope that all M&E reports that come right at the end, they aren't just put on a shelf, but they're actually used to generate new programs and to search different areas for intervention and to be of some use in the future, rather than just being parked somewhere because a project has finished. And you can see the arrows at the bottom, the list of words at the bottom just say briefly the process that takes place. Okay, next slide, please. So that was just a brief introduction to M&E, some of the core definitions and why we actually do it and the steps to it. But one key question, which we could spend probably a couple of weeks talking about, but I'll talk about it in about 5 minutes, which I think is okay, is what is truth? Okay, next slide. So when it comes to the world, it's pretty chaotic. This is quite a funny cartoon showing a typical classroom in a school. And if we were going in there as a researcher even to try and make sense of this very complicated scenario, how would we make sense of it? The world is chaotic, and M&E, by definition, therefore, has to be quite systematic, which doesn't mean it has to be numbers-based, but it still has to be fairly organized in the way it collects information and uses information to try and make sense of a very, very complex context. And the HIV context is incredibly complex in many ways, and I don't need to share any more about that, but the world is complicated. Next slide. But of course, the guy who spoke most about truth is Foucault. I always put a picture of Foucault up, partly because it's vaguely interesting, but also it kind of breaks up the sequence of just words on slides. But Foucault had a lot to say about truth, more on the political level, but he's always worthwhile exploring because for Foucault, truth changes. Truth is flexible. And whilst I don't want to get too bogged down in philosophy, but I would say that this is quite an important concept because how M&E is done and also how pure research is carried out is often just a way of describing a version of truth. We're trying to describe the world that we're seeing and collecting evidence to support our view. And the evidence that we collect and the way we report it, in a sense, can be changeable, which is why some donors, for example, have very strict reporting processes because they know that the actual truth can get lost sometime in the process of collecting information and the reporting on it. Next slide, please. So here are some quite interesting definitions of truth. There are actually 3 there. I say 2, but there are 3. Foucault says each society has a regime of truth, so it generates whatever truth it wants. Oscar Wilde says truth is rarely pure and never simple, And Ben Goldacre, who's a British writer who's talked a lot about the pharma industry, says that it's difficult to make sense of the world from the small atoms of experience we each gather as we wander around it. And while these quotes are just quotes, really, making interesting statements about truth, it is quite important when it comes to what we do in M&E, because all we're really doing, as I mentioned earlier, is trying to find out something systematic about a chaotic world, trying to make some sense in things that we see, which actually often are happening at different times in response to certain things. And therefore, it's important to be systematic about how M&E is done, because at least it means you're getting closer to what is actually going on out there. But of course, there are different versions of truth when it comes even to research and to M&E, because there is the real world, which is the world of tick boxes, and we did this and we did that. But there's also the world of the person who is being affected by the intervention. So what about their perspective of the world? So the person who is attending the training, what are they seeing? What is their experience? The person who is attending a new HIV project in the centre of a city or something, what is he or she? What are they actually feeling about the project? What's the benefit for them? Is it going to change their lives? And both these versions of truth, where we have the real world of actually doing something and the world of the individual, which is often how somebody sees something, both are very, very important when it comes to M&E. But how we shape an M&E strategy depends on which version we want. But good M&E usually has a bit of both. And this is why, from my experience, a qualitative approach to M&E is often very important to tag on to the more process-driven parts of M&E, because at least it means you find out more about impact. Okay, next slide, please. This is too wordy, this slide. I don't know why I did this. Next slide, go on, move on. Thank you. So when it comes to truth, basically for M&E, we want to know if the project did what it said it would. So by the end of a project, you want to know if it's done everything it planned to do in the work plan. But secondly, we also want to see what the impact has been on people. Has it changed their lives in any meaningful sense? And in both of these areas of truth, we, in an M&E strategy, particularly at the evaluation stage at the end, we would like to see some kind of causal link between an intervention or an incident or something and the impact it's had at the end. And it's showing that causal link, which is part of what I was just saying about truth, which is part of saying, yes, we think this is true because of these bits of evidence. And therefore, good M&E, particularly the M&E that I've done, which is based on a systematic qualitative M&E, you can use 2 or 3 different types of evidence, even in qualitative type data, to say, yes, we have these bits of evidence to say this outcome is linked to that. And you can do that in M&E, and it should be defined in the strategy that you set up right at the beginning. Okay, so next slide, please. So I've talked about the background and definition of M&E, talked a bit about truth and about making sure that we know which perspective we're taking and appreciating that there are process type truths, but also impact type truths. And therefore M&E uses a bit of both of these, particularly in advocacy-based projects. So thirdly, what about setting up some kind of M&E strategy? How do we actually begin to do that? Okay, next slide, please. So in an M&E framework, and I'm talking about focusing specifically on advocacy-based projects, there are a number of components which are included somewhere. Firstly, a theory of change. Now I'm going to talk about theory of change in a couple of minutes. These are now pretty standard across most sectors in international development work, and in fact most certainly government level donors require it as part of the process. So theory of change. Secondly, that's a series of objectives which are SMART, and I'll talk again about SMART objectives in a minute, derived from realistic short and medium term outcomes. And these are the things that are measurable, so we know we've achieved the objective. Thirdly, there will be established methods for data collection and recording information throughout. Now, I mentioned something here which I haven't spoken about yet, and I won't talk too much more beyond this, but one of the projects I worked on recently used what's called an advocacy log. So this log was like a diary that was kept by each organisation, And what they did in the diary is that the log is that each time they interacted with somebody, and it could be face-to-face, it could be in the corridor, it could be using social media via WhatsApp, could be a Facebook post or something, they noted it down, and they wrote what happened, what the impact was, what the implications were, and therefore after about a year worth of the project, after about a year, they had about 5 or 6 pages of these things, these incidents that they recorded about what was happening regarding advocacy activities, which was interesting for them because they realized, oh, actually, this advocacy, even though it might have just been a talk in the corridor, was actually worthwhile because following that conversation, the words that I used to this person seem to have turned up somewhere in a policy statement, and therefore that can be seen as a direct link. And certainly for an evaluator coming in, especially after a long project, say a 2 or 3 year project, seeing 3 years worth of an advocacy log is incredibly useful because you can start to see the causal links between certain things, conversations people had. In Malaysia, the projects I was working on, they rarely used email to communicate with advocacy targets, but they did use WhatsApp, and WhatsApp is widely used in Malaysia and elsewhere in Asia, much more in some senses than email. So seeing the WhatsApp conversations in the advocacy log was really useful to be able to look back and say, ah, yes, we could see a connection between those types of things. And then the last point on this slide is many or most people should be involved in the M&E at some stage, from the beginning to the end. It isn't just one person, it's a collective thing because you have different people collecting information, different people feeding back from certain things. Therefore, M&E shouldn't be a closed process. It should be a live process, which is as an important part of project management as other things that are important to get a project finished on time. Okay, next slide, please. So theory of change, well, I've mentioned this, and as I mentioned, this is something which is now fairly common in most projects. And the theory of change, in my experience, is usually able to be written on one page, but with about, say, 3 or 4 pages of text, maybe 2 pages of text to accompany it. But it can take quite a while to develop a theory of change. And the last time I did it for a group, well, with a group, it took us 3 days to generate a theory of change for one particular project. And it's because it requires you to know what you're doing in the future 2 or 3 years ahead of time, rather than just doing a training or doing some kind of thing. It asks you to, so what will you want to have achieved at this particular point? What's the outcome? And that can be quite a challenging thought process. So it's a visual diagram. It shows a set of activities or strategies and the connection between them. So you get to an outcome 2 years ahead. How will you know you're getting there? What route will you take to get that outcome? So it's like a map, really. It's a strategic map. And it makes explanations, it provides explanations about key assumptions you need to get to a certain point. And also, the last point on this slide, it also provides links to evaluation type questions you might want to ask at the end. What's important is the theory of change is not a work plan and it's not a logical frame. It's much more for monitoring and evaluation of outcomes as you go through. So it's specifically for M&E in my experience, but it's a very, very valuable way, particularly in advocacy, which is very hard to measure quantitatively, but it's a good way of visualizing it. So the next slide, please. So what does it have? It has short-term outcomes, which are often things that come immediately after something you've done. It has medium-term outcomes, which are a direct result of the short-term outcomes, so there should be a connection. For example, there is knowledge retention after an event which has been applied in context. And then long-term outcomes, which is often the SMART objective. And these are things you would expect to see maybe 6 or 12 months down the line. And it has what's called pathways to change. And this is simply a narrative that connects them all together. So you do a training, for example. So you have some short-term outcomes that people attended and seem to know more than they did before the training. You then have medium-term outcomes where people are applying the knowledge, specific knowledge they got from the training, so linking the short-term to the medium-term, and you can see that person getting more involved in planning in their organization. And then the long-term will be some key change, some key thing that will be linked to the medium-term outcome. For example, if it's training to set up an HIV testing program, right at the end, you will see more people attending for HIV testing in that context, linked to, and they should all be linked back to the initial thing you did, which was training about HIV programming. And then the pathways to change is simply a narrative that you would expect to link all those three processes. Next slide, please. So this is a very generic theory of change, which I developed as part of the Link Up program for the International AIDS Alliance. And I'm not going to talk through all this, but you can see how it's linked together. But the most important thing about a theory of change, it's developed backwards. So you start at the end, if you like. You start with the long-term impact and goal. Then you work back to the SMART objectives or long-term outcomes. Then you work back to the medium term. Then you work back to the short term. So therefore, they're always arranged backwards. It's no point in starting at the beginning because it's counterintuitive. You do need to start from the end and come towards you, and therefore it makes much more meaningful outcomes that you can actually achieve. And the next slide, please. And I'm not going to talk through this, but this is a real theory of change in action. This was developed in Myanmar by Alliance Myanmar to look at developing better information about HIV and sexual reproductive health integration of services for young key populations. I'm not going to read it through, but you'll be able to read it in your own time. But you can see the arrows, and the purpose of the arrows is to show that there is a direct link between each outcome going on to the next outcome, then going on to the long term. And you'll see also in this is a good example, is that there are only 2 long-term outcomes or SMART objectives. These are actually SMART objectives, which will be the long-term outcomes. But there are only 2. There doesn't have to be a huge amount because it's almost impossible to achieve a huge amount of outcomes. We just haven't got the funding and haven't got the time. So therefore, throughout this project, and we had 5 countries in total working on this long 3-year project, each of them only had 2 long-term outcomes. And then medium term, they had 3 on this particular example. Then short term, they had 4. So it doesn't have to be a hugely complex diagram. And that's why I believe it's nice to fit it all at once onto one page. Okay, the page might be a big page, but it can be described on one page, and I think that's important to keep things realistic and achievable rather than trying to set unachievable goals and unachievable outcomes for each project. Okay, next slide, please. So I've mentioned these already, and I don't really need to add to this. The short-term outcomes, usually process outcomes, and they happen quite soon after a particular intervention. Medium-term outcomes are interim, where you have a sense of progress towards reaching the long term. So it could be slight changes of behaviour, it could be a change in local policy, it could be new training developed, and then the long term is the one that comes right at the end, and you will see specific changes, often in the community, for example, in the kind of work we do, or a change in policy if it's advocacy for policy change. But what I would say is at the bottom of this slide is you see these are not activities, these are outcomes, and that's important because when I first started training people for doing theories of change, they're often tended to put in activities. So the short-term outcome is running 3 trainings on this, but that goes in the work plan, which is fine. But an outcome would be an X number of people are attending and X number of people will have advanced knowledge about this after the training. So it's a specific statement as an outcome, and that's an important distinction to make. And the last time point in this slide is that the above are often a mix of process and outcome statements, or impact statements, I should say. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I think it's important to keep it balanced and to have impact-based statements mixed up with the process base, because it's the process that often gains the upper hand, because they're easier to say and easier to measure, but it's the impact outcomes we want to include as well. Okay, so next slide. So smart objectives, or smart statements, I think you all know about these, so I don't really want to talk in depth about these. But in a theory of change, the long-term outcomes are usually smart objectives. And it's important to include each of these indicators that you have as smart objectives. So is it specific? Is it measurable? Is it attainable? Can you really do it? And at the beginning of a project, it's quite hard to anticipate, but this is why developing theories of change in particular take a lot of thought, because you really are trying to anticipate what you will achieve at this particular point, which is very, very useful for planning, but is something that is often not focused on. Is it relevant to the program? Yeah, okay. And is there a deadline? Yeah, it's clear. You will do it by this time. But that's quite important, because it does help from an M&E perspective. It does help to have clear time-bound statements of intent. This will be achieved by this time, because then we can go on to the next one and then on to the next one. Okay, next slide. And this is just some examples from the Link Up program we use for training in smart objectives. And yeah, you can see this is an example of a smart statement. Include integrated services for young people in a national strategic plan by 2014. Very specific and measurable. You can see it in the plan. Not smart, increase the involvement of youth in national policy processes. Well, what does that mean? Doesn't mean anything really. And then lastly, smart, ensure one young person affected by HIV sits on the Global Fund CCM by the end of 2014. Very specific, it's measurable, it's focused, and you know you've achieved it. And if you've got a statement that is not measurable, it needs changing and probably needs simplifying, because when you start focusing on statements to make them smart, it often cleans them up and gets rid of the woolliness and makes them more focused on, okay, well, we'll do this by this time. And therefore it's much more realistic to be able to achieve. And therefore, even though it's painful for your brain, thinking about something and making it focused and smart actually does help in the long run in project efficiency. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oh, there we are. Okay, so how to collect data. We've been talking all the way through about truth and smart and theories of change, whatever. But for M&E, how do we actually collect data? And this is a very broad list of ways in which I've collected data before, mainly for evaluations, but certainly the same applies to monitoring as well. So firstly, it's got to be done ethically. I mentioned right at the beginning, this is very important, and any information that we note down has to protect the individuals, especially in our field. Secondly, you can use questionnaires, fixed questions or open-ended questions. Thirdly, you can use interviews. I've done a lot of interviews for project evaluations, but it should be everybody, obviously, so it should be beneficiaries, project managers, stakeholders, and also I put in bellwether interviews. Now, these are interesting interviews which aren't always done because they can be tricksy to set up, but that's when you ask somebody completely unrelated to the specific project, but maybe in the field. So it has nothing to do with the organisation, nothing to do specifically with the topic, but maybe more broadly involved in health. And you ask very general questions about certain things, and then if they, without being prompted, say, oh yes, I've heard this organisation's doing this, then that indicates they've heard of the work, even though they're not actually directly linked to it. So as an advocate, that can indicate to you that the advocacy is getting out there to places that you didn't expect. So bellwether interviews can be tricky to set up because they've got to be carefully managed, and you've got to be careful not to preempt, but they can be useful. And if you don't know, the term bellwether means a signal of something that's coming. So a signal of something that isn't directly present yet. And documentation, this is obvious, but you can use test results, depending on the project, demographic information of beneficiaries, narrative reports, formal monitoring and documentation, including progress and indicators. But it can also include, this is important, particularly for impact evaluations, social media communications. Has the advocate actually talked to anybody, to the advocacy targets, and do they communicate via some other way? And I mentioned Malaysia earlier on, and the advocate in Malaysia was in direct communication with an MP in the government who was actually advocating on the behalf of harm reduction advocates in government. So he was constantly in touch with her to ask for information via WhatsApp. Can you send me this document? I'm in government tomorrow. Can you send me this document? And therefore, that's, for an evaluator, that does indicate that the organisation is well connected at national level in advocacy, and that kind of to and fro is useful to show that. It could be emails. We would also recommend, as an M&E person, I would always recommend that people keep emails in a separate file, especially emails relating to advocacy processes, because after a couple of years you can open the file and see the activities that have gone on using emails regarding advocacy. And also corridor talks. Catching somebody in the corridors of the government or something, or in the corridors of a donor, or the corridors of some organisation, noting it down, so that when you come back to it 6 months later, you can say, yes, that conversation led to this, led to that. And meeting minutes as well. Okay, so that's how we collect useful data. And then the next thing is how we report on data. So the next slide, please. So what do we do when we collect all the data together? What have we done with it all? What do we do? Well, firstly, we analyze it. Questionnaires can be analyzed. If it's using, well, yeah, I put the hand down here, you can use SPSS, you can do, but only if you're brave. You can use Excel, which is what I've done in the past, where you put the questions in and you put in people's comments. And some of them are quite closed and specific. Some of them are open-ended responses. You can use Excel. But if you're using pure interviews, and most of my evaluation work, certainly for advocacy-based projects, has been via interview, then you can actually do a deeper thematic analysis if you want to. And this can involve things like stories of significant change. Now, this is something I haven't spoken about, and I won't speak about anymore beyond this point. But the methodology for significant change is an interesting qualitative approach to evaluation, which does pick up impact on people. So it's when you talk to people and gather some information about how they may have accessed a project or been impacted by a project, and then ask them to tell you a story about a particular change that they think has come around as a direct result of attending a new project or something, a new service. And this can be really useful, because if you interview enough people, then you can have 20 or 30 stories about the impact on people's lives. And that can be a very interesting and rich qualitative approach to gathering information about impact. And I try to build in certainly short stories in most of the evaluations I've done, stories of impact on people's lives, some kind of, a couple of paragraphs of how people say, it was like this for me before, I attended this service, and now it's like this now. And if you have even 10 people saying that, it really does give interesting evidence and useful evidence that validates that this project or whatever, an intervention, has had an impact on somebody's life, because these people, 10 people, said it impacted on their lives. So that can be quite useful. And in this point, on this slide as well, I mentioned a software called NVivo. This is actually used by qualitative researchers for pure research. So I wouldn't, if you're not interested in it, you don't need it. But if you have experience in pure qualitative research and you've thought of using a software package that can take you to quite a deep level of thematic analysis, NVivo could be worth exploring, but it's not necessarily. not necessarily for all projects, but it's a useful deep level approach to analysing. And both this NVivo and of course SPSS, which I'm sure you have heard of, have both been developed by pure researchers to use in analysing quantitative or qualitative information. So regarding reporting, obviously you write a report, a long report, obviously. These things can sometimes be huge, but also I do believe in the importance of feedback. So it's important, I think, once an evaluation at the end of a project has been done, that there is some kind of policy or summary brief that is developed so that people know what the findings were. It could be a two-sided report, particularly around lessons learned. And it does mean that the report, which is often runs to 60 or 70 pages, and it therefore won't be read by a lot of people, doesn't stay stuck on a shelf. A policy brief will get out there. It can be shared. In fact, I'm presenting soon at a harm reduction conference about the findings from the evaluation I did in the Asia Action Project I've spoken about. So it's getting, the findings are getting out there. This is what we found. These are the impacts of the project, but this is the M&E that was able to demonstrate these outcomes and impacts. So at least it's getting out there, and I think that's very important. Okay, next slide then, please. So application, and this is where it moves into applying some of the things I've been talking about, and particularly around Step Up. I know that there are lots of other programs that EATG is running, which is great, but this whole discussion around M&E has partly come out of discussions around, well, how do we evaluate the impact of Step Up long way down the line? How do we know it's had positive impact? Okay, next slide, please. So the most recent experience I've had, as I mentioned, is on advocacy for harm reduction and policy change in Asia. And the next slide, please. And the tools we used specifically for doing this were, we used theories of change, we used advocacy logs, we used lots and lots of different types of information for validation and triangulation. And also, and this is the first point on here, is something I haven't spoken about yet, and I won't anymore, but it can be useful, is actually developing advocacy asks, where an organisation at the beginning has 4 or 5 things that they want to get out of their advocacy. Like in Vietnam, for example, a statement in this project was an environment for voluntary community-based treatment, drug treatment, is enabled in Bac Giang province in Vietnam. So it's a very specific advocacy ask. And these are reflected in the theory of change, but also a year down the line, you can use this statement as an advocacy ask. So you can measure how it's doing. So has it been achieved? How close are we getting to getting this in Bac Giang province? So it's just an additional useful tool that can be used for evaluation, but also for project planning as well. Okay, next slide. So when we look at Step Up, you can see it has 2 core objectives in the long term. It's to provide 20 HIV treatment advocates with in-depth knowledge and skills, and it's to disseminate the knowledge and information provided in the local communities of Step Up participants. Next slide, please. And these are the expected outcomes. I'm not going to read all these through, but they're all built on the objectives. The reason I'm showing them here is, now we're thinking about M&E. So how do we go around seeing if any of these expected outcomes have been achieved? And this is what this TCWG is thinking about now. This is what EATG is thinking about now, because these outcomes are actually quite relevant. They link the objectives, and they're clearly close to EATG's core principles and the things it wants to do within the European region. But from an M&E perspective, how do we think about knowing if we've achieved these? How measurable are these, and what indicators would we set up to tell ourselves that, okay, with expected outcome 4, reducing stigma, how do we know that Step Up has achieved this? How do we go around measuring it? How do we go around getting statements about how this might have been achieved? So next slide, please. So these are the points that we'll be discussing further at TCWG, but also these are very general points that can apply to any advocacy-based projects if we want to build up some kind of M&E framework. So firstly, what do we want to know? This will be related to the broad long-term objectives. Do we have short, medium, long-term outcomes that are measurable? Yes or no? If not, write some. If we do, use these as a way of shaping the M&E that we do. What indicators do we want? What indicators can we write to link with each of the expected outcomes? From whom do we collect data for M&E? Because certainly in the M&E I've done, it's been many people, including obviously the project managers, people involved in delivering the project, so project delivery, beneficiaries, partners of beneficiaries, other major stakeholders in the region, government people. So it could be any number of possible people you can talk to and collect information from to tell you if this project has been effective, particularly from an advocacy perspective. And then how will we collect the data? What tools do we use? Do we use interviews, questionnaires? Do we use other more intangible things like social media conversations? Do we look at policy documents? And this should all be stated in the framework. So when a project is set up, or when M&E for a project is being planned, this should all be set up right at the beginning, so you can then hit the ground running. And who will collect the data, obviously? And what's the time scale? This is important because for monitoring, of course, the time scale goes from beginning to end. It goes from day one of the project to the last day of the project. The evaluation is done at a period of time towards the end of a program, ideally after the program's closed, but there may be an overlap. But then if there's an overlap, then the evaluation must reflect the fact that the program hasn't quite finished and there are other activities taking place. But I put a note here that major donors, in fact all donors, usually have a deadline. So I don't know, it depends. I know the EU has I think a 2-month deadline. So they want to report on their desk 2 months after project closure. And they'll also, as will other donors, they'll also want to know what's happening during, they'll want a 1-year report, a 2-year report, a 3-year report which reports on year 3 if it's a 3-year project, and then a full evaluation of the whole of the program. So the timescale is important, and as I've mentioned already, the timescale for an M&E framework, what it sets up, is just as important as the work plan. So it should be built into the work plan right from the beginning, so that you're constantly collecting information that can be used for evaluation. So next slide, please. So concluding thoughts. Thanks. Next slide. So the last slide before, if there are any questions, do share them. If not, that's fine. First of all, M&E is about comparing actual outcomes and impacts, or what actually came out of it, with what was expected. Secondly, M&E does need to be quite systematic. It doesn't mean that you can't collect qualitative-based information, but it should be collected within a framework, so you know at least that there is some concepts which you're addressing. Thirdly, M&E should be planned right from the beginning of the project, and a theory of change should be used. I would certainly recommend for all projects a theory of change, because it makes you really think right at the beginning of a project what you want to have at this point and this point, and what the link is between them all. And I think that link is so important to be able to describe. And lastly, effective M&E requires planning. Effective M&E planning requires contributions from everybody involved in a program. Not just the M&E officer, but everybody involved in the program, and eventually for the evaluation, particularly from beneficiaries, because only then can we really see what the impact of a program has been. We as an organisation can say we've done this training, but only the beneficiary can tell us if it's had an impact on his or her life. So therefore it involves all people engaged in the program. Okay, next slide. Okay, and that's all I've got to say. Thank you so much for listening. I do appreciate it. If you've got questions, do share them. If not, feel free to email me. And this recording and the slides will be available afterwards.